There is a strange irony in life. The harder we resist something, the more it finds a way to consume us. We swear never to be like our parents, yet one day we catch ourselves saying the exact words they used to say. We hate arrogance but unknowingly become self-righteous in our pursuit of humility. We despise controlling figures, yet in our desperation to maintain our freedom, we become controlling ourselves. Why does this happen? Why do we become what we hate? This is about the unconscious transformation that takes place within us when we define ourselves by what we oppose. The things we hate shape us often more than the things we love because hatred is intense, consuming, and persistent. And if we are not careful, it will turn us into the very thing we swore we would never be. Psychologists, philosophers, and even history itself have shown us time and time again that resistance, when unconscious, breeds imitation. The more we fixate on something, whether it be an ideology, a behavior, or a person, the more it embeds itself into our identity, regardless of whether our feelings toward it are positive or negative. Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in psychology, introduced the concept of the shadow, the hidden parts of ourselves that we suppress because they are too painful or unacceptable to acknowledge. He warned that if we do not integrate these hidden aspects, they will control us from the shadows, manifesting in ways we never intended. This will explore the role of the shadow in our unconscious transformation, showing how unhealed wounds and unresolved emotions silently shape our behaviors. Beyond psychology, we will also look at history, society, and personal experiences to understand why this phenomenon is so universal. From dictators who began as revolutionaries to individuals who despised authority but became tyrants in their own homes, the cycle repeats itself in every aspect of human life. But this is not just about identifying the problem, it is about breaking free from it. By becoming aware of these unconscious transformations, we gain the power to choose who we become rather than being shaped by the things we despise. We will explore how to consciously shape our identity, process our emotions, and redefine our beliefs so that we are not prisoners of our past. So before we begin, I want you to ask yourself, what is something you have always hated? A person, a behavior, a belief system? Have you truly escaped it, or have you unknowingly carried a piece of it within you? This is about finding those answers. Chapter 1. The Trap We Can't See. Most people believe they are actively shaping their lives, making their own choices, and building their own identity. But what if, instead of consciously becoming who we want to be, we are simply running in the opposite direction of something we despise only to end up in the same place? Imagine a person who grew up in a strict household, constantly told what to do, controlled at every turn. They hate it. They vow to never become like their parents. But as they grow older, they realize something unsettling. In their effort to avoid control, they have become obsessed with their own sense of freedom. So much so that they now impose their beliefs on others, becoming just as rigid as the people they swore they would never be. This is the trap. When we define ourselves by opposition rather than intention, we do not escape. We mirror. How resistance shapes us. Psychologically, our minds absorb whatever we give attention to. If we constantly think about how much we hate something, we are still centering our thoughts around it. This means it is still influencing us whether we realize it or not. A classic example is the white bear effect, a psychological experiment where participants were told not to think about a white bear. The result? They couldn't stop thinking about it. The more we suppress something, the stronger it becomes in our subconscious. When we live our lives constantly pushing against something, we are actually keeping it alive inside us. It's not just personal. Societies too fall into this cycle. Revolutions overthrow oppressive governments, only to replace them with new regimes that are just as corrupt. Groups that fight against intolerance sometimes become intolerant themselves. The oppressed often become the oppressors, and history repeats itself in an endless loop. Consider historical revolutions. The French Revolution began as a fight for freedom, but those who once opposed tyranny ended up creating the Reign of Terror, executing thousands in the name of justice. The Soviet Union, built on the rejection of oppression, became one of the most oppressive regimes in history. On a personal level, think about workplace dynamics. A person who resents being micromanaged finally becomes a manager themselves. Instead of leading with trust, they overcompensate, micromanaging their own team to avoid the failures they once experienced. They have become what they resented, but they don't even realize it. Breaking the illusion. The first step to breaking this cycle is awareness. Ask yourself, am I shaping my identity based on what I want, or based on what I reject? Do I focus so much on avoiding something that I have unknowingly become controlled by it? If I stripped away all the things I hate, who would I be? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. Because the truth is, if we do not consciously decide who we want to become, life and the things we despise will decide for us. The key is intention. Instead of defining ourselves by resistance, we must define ourselves by creation. What do we want to be rather than what do we want to avoid? Who do we admire rather than who do we reject? When we focus on these things, we take back control. Hatred is a powerful force, but it is not a guide. It is a chain. If we only know what we hate, we will never truly know who we are. The way out of the trap is not through opposition but through understanding, self-awareness, and conscious choice. This is the trap we can't see. And this is where our journey begins. Chapter 2: The Echoes of Our Past. Every belief, every fear, and every hatred we carry is rooted in something. No one wakes up one day and randomly decides to despise a particular behavior or ideology. These feelings are echoes, resonances of experiences that have shaped us, often from childhood. Many of our strongest emotions, whether love or hate, originate in our earliest years. If a child is constantly dismissed when they express their emotions, they might grow up with a deep resentment toward authority. If someone is frequently lied to, they might develop an extreme intolerance for dishonesty. But rather than addressing these wounds, we often channel our pain into external opposition. Psychologists call this reaction formation when we overcompensate in the opposite direction of something we dislike, only to become an exaggerated version of it. A child who grows up with strict parents might develop an extreme aversion to discipline, becoming overly lenient and passive in adulthood. A person who hated being ignored might develop an overwhelming need for attention, even at the cost of others' boundaries. But the problem is, when we define ourselves purely by opposition, we are not making a choice, we are reacting. A person who hates being controlled may become obsessed with independence, refusing to rely on anyone even when it harms them. Another who despises dishonesty might become brutally honest, not realizing that truth without compassion can be just as damaging as a lie. The past is never really gone, it lingers in the choices we make, the emotions we suppress, and the identities we construct. The key to escaping its hold is not avoidance but understanding. The more we recognize where our dislikes come from, the more we can make choices that are truly ours, rather than dictated by past wounds. Consider a person who was bullied in school. They might grow up hating bullies, vowing to stand up against them. But in their fight for justice, they might start humiliating and attacking those they perceive as bullies, turning into the very thing they once feared. They are not standing against cruelty, they are trapped in its cycle, merely switching roles. The same pattern plays out in relationships. Someone who grew up with emotionally unavailable parents might resent emotional detachment, yet find themselves pushing people away the moment they get too close. Another who suffered from constant criticism might vow to always be supportive, yet unknowingly smother their loved ones with overprotection, making them feel just as trapped. Even on a societal level, history proves this cycle again and again. The oppressed become oppressors. The victimized, when given power, sometimes seek revenge instead of change. Political movements that rise in opposition to tyranny often become just as authoritarian as those they replaced. Why? Because they are not building something new. They are reacting to something old. Breaking free from this pattern requires deep self-reflection. We must ask ourselves, are we acting from a place of conscious choice, or are we merely running from our past? Are we truly different from what we hate, or have we simply taken on its opposite form? True transformation does not come from opposition but from understanding. Instead of defining ourselves by what we reject, we must define ourselves by what we truly want to be. Only then can we break the cycle and become something greater than our past experiences. Chapter 3: The Illusion of Moral Superiority. One of the greatest traps we fall into when rejecting something we hate is the belief that we are better than those who embody it. We convince ourselves that we have risen above the flaws we despise, but in doing so, we often blind ourselves to our own hypocrisy. We become so fixated on not being like them that we fail to see how we, too, are capable of the very same mistakes. Consider the person who detests arrogance. They pride themselves on being humble, looking down on those who boast about their achievements. Yet, in their silent judgment, they nurture a quiet arrogance of their own. The belief that they are superior because they are not boastful. Their humility becomes a form of pride, and without realizing it, they have become what they claim to despise. The same pattern emerges in social and political movements. History is filled with revolutions that began with noble ideals, fighting against oppression, inequality, and corruption. Yet once the revolutionaries gain power, they often become just as oppressive as their predecessors. The cycle repeats because they never address the deeper issue. Power itself corrupts those who wield it without self-awareness. Their hatred for tyranny blinds them to their own tyrannical tendencies. Psychologically, this is explained by a concept called moral licensing. When people feel justified in doing something wrong because they believe they have already proven themselves to be good. A person who prides themselves on being kind might justify moments of cruelty, believing they have earned the right to lash out. A leader who believes they are fighting for justice might dismiss their own abuses of power, convinced that their cause is righteous. This illusion of moral superiority is dangerous because it makes us immune to self-reflection. The moment we believe we are better than those we dislike, we stop questioning our own actions. We become trapped in a cycle where we justify behaviors in ourselves that we would condemn in others. So how do we break free? The answer lies in radical self-awareness. Instead of asking, "Am I better than them?" we must ask, "In what ways am I the same?" Instead of defining ourselves by opposition, we must define ourselves by conscious values. If we reject cruelty, we must ensure we are not cruel. If we despise dishonesty, we must be honest, even when inconvenient. True moral superiority is not about believing we are better, it is about striving to be better every single day. It is about recognizing that we, too, have flaws, and that awareness is the only path to genuine growth. Chapter 4. The Chains of Self-Deception. We like to believe we know ourselves, that our opinions are ours, that our choices are conscious, and that our hatred is justified. But the truth is, most of us are tangled in a web of self-deception, bound by beliefs we never truly questioned. And nothing keeps us more trapped than the refusal to acknowledge our own contradictions. Think about this. How often do we criticize others for things we excuse in ourselves? We condemn people who manipulate, yet we justify our own manipulative actions as necessary. We despise selfishness, yet in moments of personal gain, we convince ourselves that our situation is different. This selective awareness keeps us stuck in the very patterns we claim to reject. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when our actions contradict our beliefs. Instead of admitting that we, too, are flawed, we subconsciously alter our perception of reality to maintain a sense of righteousness. This is why people who claim to hate liars will often lie to themselves. It's why those who resent authority might still impose control over others in different ways. But why do we do this? Because self-deception is comfortable. It protects our ego, shields us from guilt, and allows us to believe that we are the exception to the flaws we see in others. However, this comfort comes at a cost. It prevents growth. When we refuse to see our own faults, we remain prisoners to them, doomed to repeat the same mistakes under different disguises. The first step to breaking these chains is brutal honesty with ourselves. We must ask the hardest questions. What am I hiding from myself? In what ways am I guilty of the very things I despise? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. Because true change does not come from external rejection, it comes from internal recognition. Consider someone who grew up in a household where emotional neglect was common. They might promise themselves that they will never ignore the emotions of others, yet as they grow older they may find themselves struggling to offer real emotional support. Their belief in their own emotional sensitivity blinds them to the reality that they are, in fact, avoiding deep emotional engagement just in a different way. This pattern extends beyond individuals, it applies to entire societies. History proves this time and time again. Societies that claim to champion freedom have often built their foundations on oppression. Countries that preach democracy sometimes engage in imperialistic control over others. Political movements that start with good intentions often fall into the same authoritarian patterns they originally stood against. The failure to recognize these contradictions leads to the endless repetition of history's mistakes. Even in our personal relationships, self-deception plays a huge role. How many times have we labeled someone as toxic without acknowledging our own toxic behaviors? How often do we say we want honesty, yet get defensive when faced with the truth? We demand loyalty but justify our own betrayals, whether in friendships, romantic relationships, or even within families. Breaking free from self-deception requires more than just awareness, it requires action. Acknowledging our contradictions is only the beginning. We must also be willing to change, to actively challenge the habits, thoughts, and behaviors that contradict our values. And that is not an easy task. It requires humility, discomfort, and a willingness to accept that we are not always right. So what happens when we finally confront these truths? When we strip away the illusions and see ourselves as we really are, we gain power. Not the kind of power that controls others, but the power to control ourselves, to reshape our identity based on conscious choice rather than unconscious reaction. When we stop defining ourselves by what we reject and instead define ourselves by what we intentionally choose to be, we begin the journey toward true transformation. Chapter 5. Breaking the Cycle of Hate. If we are bound to become what we hate, is there any way to break free? Or are we destined to fall into the same patterns no matter how much we resist? The answer is not found in mere opposition, but in conscious transformation. To avoid becoming what we despise, we must stop defining ourselves by what we reject and start defining ourselves by what we intentionally choose to be. Hatred is a reaction. It is shaped by our experiences, our pain, and our past disappointments. It can be powerful, fueling our desire to change, but if left unchecked, it becomes our master. When we define ourselves solely by what we are against, we give it control over us. To break free, we must shift our focus from opposition to creation. Instead of saying, "I will never be like them," we should ask, "Who do I want to become?" Psychologists have long studied the power of identity formation. When we fixate on what we don't want, our subconscious often leads us directly toward it. It's like trying to avoid thinking about a pink elephant. The more we resist, the more we reinforce its presence in our minds. The same happens when we define ourselves by what we reject. Instead of crafting our own path, we remain trapped in reactionary thinking, unknowingly mirroring the very things we sought to escape. Consider someone who grew up in a home full of anger and conflict. They promise themselves they will never become like their parents. But because their entire sense of self is built on rejection rather than intention, they might find themselves struggling with emotional outbursts, unable to express frustration in a healthy way. Without conscious effort, they become a reflection of their upbringing, even if they swore they never would. The key to breaking this cycle is self-awareness. We must recognize when our hatred is shaping us rather than allowing us to shape ourselves. This means asking difficult questions. What do I truly value? How do I want to behave, not just in contrast to others, but as a person on my own path? History provides countless examples of those who have succeeded in breaking free. Leaders who have overcome cycles of violence by choosing peace. Survivors who have rejected bitterness and chosen healing. People who have grown up in broken homes and decided to rewrite their own stories with love and care. These individuals did not become who they are by simply rejecting the past, they consciously built something new. Breaking the cycle also requires forgiveness, not necessarily for others but for ourselves. We must forgive ourselves for the moments we have failed, for the times we have mirrored what we once rejected. We must recognize that growth is not a straight line, and that becoming better takes time, self-reflection, and effort. Only by accepting our own imperfections can we truly transcend them. So how do we truly escape becoming what we hate? We let go of hatred as our guiding force. We stop reacting and start creating. We take responsibility for who we are and who we are becoming. And most importantly, we recognize that we are not bound by the mistakes of the past unless we allow ourselves to be. Chapter 6. The Power of Self-Acceptance. We spend so much of our lives resisting parts of ourselves. We label certain emotions as bad, certain thoughts as shameful, and certain traits as weaknesses. But what if the key to true transformation isn't found in rejecting parts of ourselves, but in accepting them? What if the very things we despise in ourselves are not barriers to growth, but the path toward it? Self-acceptance is often misunderstood. Many believe that accepting oneself means settling, giving up on self-improvement, or allowing flaws to take control. But in reality, self-acceptance is the foundation of true change. Because when we resist who we are, we stay blind to our own patterns. When we refuse to acknowledge our darker sides, they control us from the shadows. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists, introduced the concept of the shadow self. He believed that every person has a hidden part of themselves, qualities, emotions, and desires they refuse to acknowledge. The more we reject these parts, the stronger their grip becomes. When we deny our anger, it erupts uncontrollably. When we suppress our fears, they silently dictate our choices. When we pretend we are better than we truly are, we become blind to our own weaknesses. Think about the moments in your life when you acted in ways you later regretted. Perhaps you lashed out at someone, acted selfishly, or became the very thing you claimed to hate. In those moments, was it really a lack of resistance that led you there? Or was it the refusal to acknowledge those parts of yourself until they could no longer be contained? The truth is, you cannot heal what you refuse to face. And you cannot grow if you do not first understand where you are starting from. This is why self-acceptance is not about complacency, it is about clarity. It is about seeing yourself as you truly are, flaws and all, and using that awareness to make conscious choices. History has shown that those who embrace their imperfections are often the ones who achieve the greatest transformations. Take any influential figure who has left a mark on the world. The ones who truly changed were not those who denied their flaws, but those who faced them head-on. Those who admitted their shortcomings, learned from them, and grew beyond them. This applies to every part of life. In relationships, accepting your fears and insecurities allows you to communicate honestly rather than pushing people away. In career and ambition, recognizing your weaknesses allows you to work on them rather than letting them limit you. In self-improvement, embracing where you are now gives you the power to move forward, rather than being stuck in the illusion of who you think you should be. So how do we practice self-acceptance? We start by asking the hard questions. What parts of myself do I avoid looking at? What am I afraid to admit about who I am? And instead of judging those answers, we observe them. We sit with them. We learn from them. Self-acceptance is not about loving every part of yourself instantly. It is about making peace with reality so you can change it. It is about understanding that growth does not come from pretending to be perfect, but from embracing imperfection and choosing to rise beyond it. Chapter 7. The Trap of Perfectionism. Perfection. It is the illusion we chase, the ideal we hold ourselves to, and the standard that always seems just out of reach. Society glorifies it. We are told to aim for perfection in our work, our relationships, our personal growth. But what if the pursuit of perfection is not a path to excellence, but a trap that keeps us from ever feeling truly satisfied? Perfectionism is often mistaken for self-improvement. People believe that wanting to be perfect means they have high standards, that they are simply striving to be the best version of themselves. But in reality, perfectionism is not about growth, it is about fear. Fear of failure. Fear of judgment. Fear of not being enough. And that fear does not drive us forward, it keeps us stuck. Psychologists have long studied the effects of perfectionism, and the results are striking. Instead of leading to success, perfectionism is often linked to anxiety, depression, and procrastination. When someone believes that anything less than perfect is unacceptable, they become paralyzed. They delay starting new projects because they are afraid they won't meet their own impossible standards. They hesitate to take risks because they fear failure. And when they do achieve something, it never feels like enough. There is always something they could have done better. Think about the last time you hesitated to do something because you were afraid of doing it imperfectly. Maybe you wanted to start a new hobby, but you felt embarrassed about being a beginner. Maybe you wanted to express your feelings to someone, but you worried about saying the wrong thing. Maybe you had a goal, but you kept putting it off, waiting for the perfect time to start. That hesitation, that endless waiting, That is perfectionism in action. Perfectionism also destroys creativity. The greatest artists, writers, and innovators in history did not create masterpieces by chasing perfection. They created by allowing themselves to make mistakes, to experiment, to learn from failure. The most successful people in any field are not those who demand perfection, but those who embrace imperfection as part of the process. The irony is that the more we chase perfection, the more we feel like failures. No matter how much we achieve, we will always see the flaws. We will always find reasons why we are not good enough. And in doing so, we rob ourselves of the joy of progress, the beauty of growth, and the satisfaction of simply being human. So how do we escape the perfectionist trap? We start by redefining success. Success is not about being perfect, it is about being better than we were yesterday. It is about taking action even when we are afraid. It is about valuing progress over flawlessness. We must also learn to embrace failure. Not just tolerate it, but see it as necessary. Every failure is proof that we are trying, proof that we are pushing ourselves beyond our comfort zone. The most successful people are not the ones who never fail, but the ones who fail and keep going anyway. Perfection is an illusion. Growth is real. And if we want to truly move forward, we must choose growth over the impossible pursuit of flawlessness. Chapter 8. Embracing failure as a path to growth. Failure. The word itself carries a weight. A sense of disappointment, of falling short, of not being good enough. From a young age, we are taught to avoid failure at all costs. We are punished for mistakes in school, judged for setbacks in life, and often made to feel like failure is a sign of personal weakness. But what if failure is not the enemy? What if, instead, it is the very thing we need in order to grow? The fear of failure is deeply ingrained in us. It paralyzes us, makes us second-guess our choices, and stops us from taking risks. But here's the truth. Failure is not the opposite of success. It is a necessary part of it. Every great achievement, every breakthrough, every moment of personal growth is built on a foundation of failures. Without failure, there is no learning. Without learning, there is no progress. History is filled with stories of people who failed, sometimes spectacularly, before they succeeded. Thomas Edison failed over 1,000 times before inventing the light bulb. J.K. Rowling faced multiple rejections before Harry Potter became a global phenomenon. Even some of the world's greatest thinkers, like Albert Einstein and Charles Darwin, struggled with setbacks before making their greatest discoveries. What separates these individuals from the rest is not that they never failed. It's that they refused to let failure define them. Psychologists call this a growth mindset, the belief that abilities and intelligence can be developed through effort, learning, and perseverance. Those with a growth mindset see failure as feedback, not as a final judgment. Instead of thinking, "I failed, so I'm not good enough," they think, "I failed, so I have something to learn." This simple shift in mindset changes everything. It turns obstacles into opportunities and setbacks into stepping stones. Failure is also a great teacher. It reveals our weaknesses, highlights our blind spots, and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. It teaches us resilience, adaptability, and the importance of persistence. The most valuable lessons in life often come from our lowest moments. Not because pain itself is necessary, but because struggle forces us to grow in ways comfort never could. So how can we start embracing failure instead of fearing it? 1. Reframe failure as feedback. Instead of seeing failure as proof that you're not good enough, view it as valuable information. What went wrong? What can you do differently next time? What did you learn? 2. Take action despite the fear. Waiting until you feel ready or certain is often just an excuse for avoiding discomfort. Growth happens when you step forward even when you're unsure. 3. Normalize failure in your daily life. Start small. Try new things, experiment, and allow yourself to be a beginner. The more you expose yourself to failure, the less power it has over you. 4. Celebrate progress, not just results. Even if you don't achieve your goal right away, acknowledge the effort you put in. Every small step forward is a victory. 5. Look at the bigger picture. Failure is temporary. One mistake, one setback, one disappointment does not define you. What matters is what you do next. If you have never failed, it simply means you have never tried anything truly challenging. And if you have failed, it means you are on the right path. Because only those who take risks, who push themselves, who dare to dream will ever reach something great. Chapter 9. Identity and the Fear of Change. Who are you? It sounds like a simple question, but in reality, it is one of the most complex questions a person can face. Our identity, who we believe ourselves to be, shapes our thoughts, our actions, and ultimately our future. But what happens when we want to change, yet our own sense of identity holds us back? Many people struggle to break free from their past, not because they lack the ability, but because they are trapped by their own self-image. We all carry labels. Some given to us by others, some we have given ourselves. I'm not good at this. I'm a failure. I'm just not the type of person who can succeed. These labels, once accepted, become the walls of our own prison. Psychologists call this self-concept rigidity. The idea that we see ourselves in a fixed way and resist anything that contradicts it. If someone has always identified as a failure, success can feel unnatural, even terrifying. If someone has always been seen as weak, becoming strong may feel like an impossible task. The irony is that our fear of change often keeps us in situations that make us unhappy. So why do we resist change even when we want it? The answer lies in our brain's need for consistency. The mind craves stability, even if that stability comes from an identity that harms us. When we try to change, it creates internal conflict. The old self versus the new self. This is why people self-sabotage, why they give up right before a breakthrough, why they fall back into old habits. It is not because they are weak, it is because their brain is fighting to keep them in familiar territory. But here's the truth: identity is not fixed. Who you are today is not who you have to be tomorrow. You are not bound by the mistakes of your past, the opinions of others, or even your own self-doubt. You have the power to redefine yourself at any moment. How do we break free from an identity that no longer serves us? 1. Question your labels. Whenever you catch yourself saying, "I'm just this type of person," stop and ask, is that really true? Or is it just something I've repeated so often that I believe it? 2. Adopt a flexible mindset. Instead of saying, "I'm not good at this," try saying, "I'm not good at this yet." Small shifts in language create big shifts in thinking. 3. Act like the person you want to become. If you want to be confident, start acting like a confident person would, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. Identity is shaped through action, not just thought. 4. Let go of old narratives. The past does not define you unless you allow it to. Every moment is an opportunity to rewrite your story. 5. Surround yourself with people who reinforce your new identity. Change is easier when you are around those who see the potential in you, not just the past version of you. We become what we repeatedly do, but we also become what we repeatedly believe. If we believe we are incapable, we will act accordingly. If we believe we are capable of growth, we will find ways to improve. Chapter 10. The Power of Perspective. Throughout this journey, we have explored how we unknowingly become what we hate, how our fears and identities trap us, and how failure, perfectionism, and resistance to change shape our lives. But in the end, everything comes down to one thing: perspective. Perspective is not just how we see the world. It is how we experience it. Two people can go through the same event and interpret it in completely different ways. One sees it as a tragedy, the other as an opportunity. One sees pain, the other sees growth. One sees a dead end, the other sees a new path. The difference is not in reality itself, but in the way they choose to frame it. The way we interpret our experiences dictates how we feel, how we react, and ultimately how we live. A person who sees rejection as proof that they are worthless will stop trying. A person who sees rejection as a redirection will push forward with even more determination. The same event, two entirely different outcomes. This is why changing your mindset is not about thinking positively in an unrealistic way. It is about choosing a perspective that empowers you instead of limiting you. It is about shifting from a passive observer of life to an active participant. Someone who understands that while we may not control what happens to us, we always control how we respond. So how do we shift our perspective in a way that benefits us? 1. Detach from emotions before analyzing situations. When something happens, take a step back. Instead of reacting emotionally, ask yourself, how else can I view this? Is there another way to see this situation that benefits me? 2. Reframe failure and pain as lessons. Instead of saying, "Why is this happening to me?" ask, "What is this trying to teach me?" 3. Embrace uncertainty. Not knowing the future is terrifying, but it is also full of potential. The worst-case scenario is often just a story we tell ourselves. It is rarely reality. Focus on what you can control. Worrying about things beyond your power drains you. Shift your focus to what you can change and let go of the rest. 5. See yourself as adaptable. The strongest people are not the ones who never struggle. They are the ones who learn how to move through struggle. Trust in your ability to adjust and grow. At the end of the day, life is not about eliminating struggle. It is about learning to navigate it in a way that makes you stronger, wiser, and more resilient. Everything we have talked about in this video leads to this one truth. You are not as stuck as you think you are. Your perspective shapes your reality. Change your mind and you change your life. This is not just the end of a video, but the beginning of a new way of thinking. Take these lessons, apply them, and watch how your world transforms. You are in control of your story. So make it one worth living.